Last month I gave a talk about four principles by which America looks at the world, and these four principles have ordered the world by American work. Now, these principles are deep in the American ethos, in the American founding intellectual DNA, if you want to call it. But these principles are with us and have been used as we deal with the world. They have shaped our view of the world, and they have been very important in helping to shape the world in which we now live. The roots of these four principles rests very much in Christianity. So, what I'm going to do today is present that part of the talk which deals with these four principles. Now, in the talk, I also discussed how these four principles and the world order that has come about as a result of these principles are under attack. If you're reading the American Proposition and you've been watching my YouTube videos, you're going to see where I've really talked about how it's under attack, how this order is under attack, how these principles are under attack, how the Christian order is under attack. And America is the defender of the Christian order. And we have kept that Christian order in the world for at least the last 80 years, if not longer. So if you've been reading the American Proposition, you will have heard much of the second half of my talk. However, I will give the second half of the talk probably in another week or two here on YouTube so you can listen to it. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. Four principles for world order. Okay, on June the 26th of this year, Pope Leo XIV, in a post on X, decried the current world situation. He tweeted, or he X'd, quote, "It is disheartening today that the strength of international law and humanitarian law no longer seems binding, replaced by the presumed right to overpower others," end of quote. Now, the Pope is a trained canon lawyer, and he knows how the world is ordered and what is at stake. Leo XIV knows that international law and humanitarian law is Catholic. So let us begin. For centuries, Hugo Grotius, a Dutch lawyer of some renown, was considered the father of international law. All that changed in 1934. James Brown Scott, an American of Canadian birth and a legal giant of the first decades of the 20th century, in his epic work, The Catholic Conception of International Law, which was published in 1934, wrote, "The modern law of nations, of which Victoria was the expounder, Suarez the philosopher, and Hugo Grotius the systematizer, is the contribution of what we may call, and indeed must call, the Spanish school of international law. For if Grotius was not a Spaniard by blood, he was a Spaniard in his conception of international law, so far as the basic principles of his system are concerned," end of quote. After visiting the Vatican shortly after the publication of the book, Scott wrote to the Father General of the Jesuits on September 29, 1934, that he had given a copy of his book to go to Pope Pius XI. Scott told the Father General that his book was meant to show, quote, "that the Catholic conception of international law should be and therefore must be the accepted law of nations of the future, if not of the present, if the intercourse of nations is to be, as it must be, both moral and Christian," end of quote. It is my position that this has occurred. And it was made possible, especially by America, that system that we made possible, that Christian law of nations that we made possible in at least the last 80 years, is now under attack. The key principles that I shall summarily address and that form the basis of this intercourse of nations, both moral and Christian, as Scott said, are the following. First, a focus on the person. Second, the centrality of law, natural law, law of nations, civil law, as ordering domestic and international societies. Third, the existence of a community of nations. And fourth, peace is the natural inclination and proper goal of mankind. All four of these are currently under attack by the tyrannies of the world. One dynamic that becomes apparent is that Thomism figures prominently in this analysis, and indeed in the way the Catholic Church looks at societies and international ethics. We are all familiar with Pope Leo XIII's Aeterni Patris, in which he directed that, quote, "you should all furnish to studious youth a generous and copious supply of those purest streams of wisdom flowing inexhaustibly from the precious fountainhead of the angelic doctor," end of quote. And there is a revival of scholasticism, thereby making this discussion all the more relevant. Thomism is based on reason, and it orders relationships and societies. Okay, a note before we go on. If you know me, lately I've been talking a lot about James Brown Scott. He was a lawyer by training. He founded the USC School of Law. He founded the American Journal of International Law. He assisted in the founding of the American Society of International Law. He was a U.S. expert for the Second Hague Peace Conference in 1907. He lectured at Johns Hopkins. He was chair of international law at Georgetown School of Foreign Service, secretary of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the American Commission to Negotiate Peace after World War I. He served on a committee of experts to codify international law in March of 1925. He was a U.S. delegate to the International Commission of Jurists in 1927, the American Academy of International Law, and he served on the Inter-American Bar Association and the International Law section of the American Bar Association. He developed and promulgated in 1929 a Declaration of the International Rights of Man, which was a precursor to the 1948 Universal Declaration of Human Rights. He worked repeatedly and closely with Latin American lawyers and lawyer associations, and the Declaration of the Rights and Duties of Nations with 18 Latin American bar associations. So he was heavily involved with Latin American law. I also make repeated references to John Epstein. He was one of the most underrated and insightful figures of the 20th century. He was an Anglican and converted to Catholicism in 1919 through the efforts of a father, C.C. Martindale. He served in World War I. He assisted with the League of Nations. And he was very involved in finding Catholic social thinking, especially in the area of international ethics. Epstein was a highly decorated veteran, receiving the honor of the Officer of the Order of the British Empire, the Croix de Guerre. He was named Chevalier of the Belgian Order de Leopold, and he was made a Grand Officer of the Portuguese Order of the Infant Dom Henrique. Epstein formed the Catholic Council for International Relations in the autumn of 1923. That organization was a part of the Catholic Union of International Studies, headquartered in Freiburg, Switzerland. And that organization, which I call the CUIS, was founded and approved in November 1917 by Pope Benedict XV and remained active until 1942. Affiliated groups were in Switzerland, France, Germany, Belgium, Poland, Austria, Hungary, Ireland, and elsewhere under the ecclesiastical patronage of Bishop Besson of Lausanne, Geneva, and Fribourg. In 1935, Epstein authored The Catholic Tradition of the Law of Nations, which I've referenced a lot, published for which he received a papal medal. The book examined Catholic philosophy and theology for 1900 years, presented the Catholic position on the natural law and the law of nations. Of note, Epstein worked with the International Union of Social Studies at Malines, or the IUSS, begun by Belgian Cardinal Franz-Joseph Mercier and continued by Cardinal Joseph von Ruy. He would later edit a work known as the Code of International Ethics, which published in 1953 under the imprimatur and the nihil obstat of Francis P. Keogh, the Archbishop of Baltimore. And that book set out a concise form of the Catholic version of natural law and the law of nations. So there's three parts to the talk. I'm going to talk about the first part here today, concern itself with the principles rooted in Catholic thought that form the international order. The second will partly demonstrate American efforts in putting these principles into practice. And then the third part will be a summary of the attack on these principles in the current world order. So the second part of my talk will be part of two and then all of three. Okay, so the four principles: the person, a community of nations, the rule of law, and peace. First, the primacy of the person. All focuses on the development and all things must focus on the development and perfection of the person. In March 2024, Pope Francis reminded us of this with his address to the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences upon the 750th anniversary celebration of the death of St. Thomas Aquinas. He said, or wrote, "Contemporary social sciences approach human affairs and the pursuit of human flourishing through a variety of approaches and methods that should be grounded in the irreducible reality and dignity of the human person. Aquinas was able to draw upon a rich philosophical heritage, which he interpreted through the lens of the gospel in order to affirm that the person as the most perfect things in all nature, from the Summa Theologica, is the pillar of the social order. Created in the image and likeness of the triune God, individuals are meant through personal and interpersonal relationships to live, to grow, develop within communities. For this reason, it is natural that human beings should live in society with many others in order to procure by the work of their hands and body, enlightened by the right use of their intelligence and the strength of the will, the material and the spiritual goods for their well being and good living and for their happiness. And that's from De Regno, end of quote. As Popes Benedict XV and Pius XI said before, Pius XII also noted that international disorders are the result of domestic disorders or disorders within countries. Pius XII, in his Christmas message from December 1942, said, quote, "He who would have the star of peace to shine permanently over society must do all in his power to restore to the human person the dignity which God conferred upon him from the beginning. He must resist the excessive herding together of human beings as though they were a soulless mass. He must set his face against their disintegration in economic, social, political, intellectual, and moral life, against their lack of solid principles and firm convictions, against their excessive reliance upon instinct and emotion, and against their fickleness of mood. He must favor, by all legitimate means and in every sphere of life, social forms which render possible and guarantee full personal responsibility in regard to things both temporal and spiritual." End of quote. Harkening to that theme and writing in 1946, Jacques Maritain distinguished the person from an individual, and he did so in the context of major social systems that had presented throughout history. He made a distinction between one who lived in a hedonistic, individualistic society, with one living in an ethnic corporate society, with one living in a communist society, and with one living in the liberal order, or a democracy as he called it. He went on to say, in the final analysis, the relation of the individual to society must not be conceived after the atomistic and mechanistic pattern of bourgeois individualism, which destroys the organic social totality, or after the biological and the animal pattern of the status or racist totalitarian conception, which swallows up the person. Here reduced to a mere histological element, a behemoth or leviathan in the body of the state, or after the biological and industrial pattern of the communistic conception, which ordains the entire person, like a worker in the great human hive, to the proper work of the social whole. The relation of the individual to society must be conceived after an irreducibly human and specifically ethico-social pattern that is personalist and communalist at the same time. The organization to be accomplished is one of liberties, but an organization of liberties is unthinkable apart from the moral realities of justice and civil amity, which on the natural and temporal plane correspond to what the gospel calls brotherly love on the spiritual and supernatural plane." End of quote. Society and social life therefore requires a common work of its members. The quote common work of society is the freedom of expansion of the person together with all the guarantees which this freedom implies and the diffusion of good that flows from it. In short, the political common good is a common good of human persons. And thus it turns out that in subordinating oneself to this common work, by the grace of justice and amity, each one of us is still subordinated to the good of persons, to the accomplishment of the personal life of others, and at the same time to the interior dignity of one's own person. In this light, the tendency towards the materialism and atheism inherent in the city of the individual appears as one of the absurdities by which it destroys itself. In the political order, the internal dialectic of this tendency, by a similar absurdity, drags it towards dictatorship, which is its proper negation. Pope St. John the 23rd in Pacem in Terris wrote, paragraph 8 and 9, "We must devote our attention first of all to that order which should prevail among men. Any well-regulated and productive association of men in society demands the acceptance of one fundamental principle, that each individual man is truly a person. His is a nature that is endowed with intelligence and free will. As such, he has rights and duties, which together flow as a direct consequence from his nature. These rights and duties are universal and inviolable, and therefore altogether inalienable." End of quote. Rights give rise to duties, and set out in part 1 of John the 23rd's encyclical, as he sets out there. Rights include political rights, material rights, rights to worship God, right to choose one nation in life, one station in life, economic rights, rights of meetings and associations. The Pope wrote, "Man's personal dignity involves his right to take an active part in public life and to make his own contribution to the common welfare of his fellow citizens. As Pope Pius XII said, man as such, far from being an object or as it were an inert element in society, is rather its subject, its basis, and its purpose, and so must be esteemed. He went on to write that men must live together and consult each other's interests, and that each individual will make his wholehearted contribution to the creation of a civic order in which rights and duties are ever more diligently and more effectively observed. He went on explaining that when society is formed on a basis of rights and duties, men have an immediate grasp of spiritual and intellectual values and have no difficulty in understanding what is meant by truth, justice, charity, and freedom. End of quote. The person is essential to the common good, while including the quote various characteristics of distinctive of each individual people. The common good can never exist fully and completely unless the human person is taken into account at all times. The common good is best safeguarded when personal rights and duties are guaranteed. End of quote. The common good of the international community is based on the same principles as the common good of each individual state. John the 23rd wrote, quote, the common good of individual states is something that cannot be determined without reference to the human person, and the same is true of the common good of all states taken together. Hence, the public authority of the world community must likewise have as its special aim the recognition, respect, safeguarding, and promotion of the rights of the human person. This can be done by direct action if need be, or by the creation throughout the world of the sort of conditions in which rulers of individual states can more easily carry out their specific functions. End of quote. Second, community of nations and a world government. The Catholic view is and always has been that there is a community of nations or an international society, and not the anarchic society, as John Mearsheimer says. Epstein wrote in Code of International Ethics that, quote, mankind therefore constitutes a single family, and no difference of race, color, language, or nationality can hide the indestructible unity of that family, end of quote. Each person contributes to the common good and exists in a system of relationships of ever-growing complexity, families, township, profession, state, that eventually affects the human race as a whole, end of quote. Each state, in order to provide the full good of human life to each of its members, can only do so if all states mutually assist one another. Citing to St. Augustine, he writes, the family, political society, and international society, the domus, the urbs, and the orbis, are institutions of natural law, since they correspond to certain fundamental needs of human nature, end of quote. A community needs a governing authority, or ethnarchy, over the community of nations to act as a political authority. This idea gained considerable credibility with Luigi Tapparelli, a Jesuit, one of the greatest proponents of the natural law, and someone who was most influential on Gaetano Pecci, who later became Pope Leo XIII. Epstein, writing in the 1930s, after reviewing Christian history to include Tapparelli's writings and those of other theologians and philosophers, explained that, quote, one of the most interesting conclusions of Tapparelli's treatise of natural law is that polyarchy, that is, authority residing equally in a number of moral persons, is the right and natural form of national society. Natural form of international society. And the ethnarchy, or authority for the whole race, which he sought to evolve, is by the whole context of his work, one which would be consistent with Christian and Catholic order of society. The obligations of obedience to an international authority established by duly constituted governments is no other quality than the duty of obedience to the Roman magistrates for whom St. Clement prayed, end of quote. However, the Christian notion also was in favor of the situation in which, quote, the necessary international institutions should be established by the secular power, their functions in relation to the papacy being similar to those of the state in relation to the church and civil society, end of quote. Also, since, quote, the natural form of the society of nations being polyarchic, the necessary institutions of conciliation, arbitration, and justice must be established through an accord or convention between the governments of states, end of quote. Such a convention as a dual sanction in the moral order. It is a duty of social justice, and it is a promise on the part of each contracting party, the violation of which is prohibited by the moral law. These same rules, these same principles of the natural law that apply in domestic society call for a world government, and they call for a community of nations that has real political power. John the 23rd writes, immense common interests make it imperative that as long last a world community of nations be established, end of quote. In support of this, John the 23rd noted the, quote, growing economic interdependence between states, that a kind of world economy is being born from the simultaneous integration of the economies of individual states, and that each country's social progress, order, security, and peace are necessarily linked with the social progress, order, security, and peace of every other country, end of quote. He recognized the long held view that no state can fittingly pursue its own interests in isolation from the rest, nor under such circumstances can it develop itself as it should, as the prosperity and progress of any state is in part consequence and in part cause of the prosperity and progress of all other states. This is so because there is a universal common good, but modern states are incapable of ensuring it all on their own. Therefore, quote, we are thus driven to the conclusion that the shape and the structure of political life in the modern world and the influence exercised by public authority in all the nations of the world are unequal to the task of promoting the common good of all peoples, end of quote. Scott's book, entitled Catholic Conception of International Law, was subtitled Francisco de Vitoria, founder of the modern law of nations, Francisco Suarez, founder of the modern philosophy of law in general, and in particular of the laws of nations, and a critical examination and a justified appreciation of both. Scott was long involved with the countries of Latin America, as I said, is influenced by and studied Victoria and Suarez. He examined the works of Victoria and Suarez, both of whom relied on scripture, theology, and philosophy. He wrote, to Suarez, the existence of states as isolated and unrelated entities, it was impossible, for he also saw the world as an integrated, if inorganic, international community. The rational basis of this branch of law, indeed, consists in the fact that the human race, howsoever many the various peoples and kingdoms into which it may be divided, always preserves a certain unity, not only as to specifics, but also, as it were, a moral and political unity called for by the natural precept of mutual love and mercy, which applies to all, even to strangers of any nation. Therefore, although a given sovereign state, commonwealth, or kingdom may constitute a perfect community in itself, consisting of its own members, nevertheless, each one of these states is also, in a certain sense, and viewed in relation to the human race, a member of that universal society, for never are these states, when standing alone, so self-sufficient that they do not require some mutual assistance, association, and intercourse, at times for the greater welfare and advantage, but at other times because also of some moral necessity or lack, as is clear from experience, end of quote. The third principle, the centrality of law, which is the natural law, the law of nations, international law, and the rule of law. Again, this is the third of four principles that is in America's basic intellectual ethos, intellectual DNA, in how it looks at the world and governs its relations in the world. These principles also have root within American domestic society. Third, the centrality of law, the natural law, the law of nations, international law, and the rule of law. The natural law is certain first principles. And the law of nations is that body of right conduct that flows from first principles and is supplemented in its content by secondary principles, custom and positive law, and they are of a general nature. This is to be distinguished from civil law, or more specific, more particularized law. St. Thomas Aquinas in Summa Theologica explained in part 1.2, question 95, article 4, because to the law of nations belong those things which are derived from the law of nature as conclusions from premises. For example, just buyings and sellings and the like, without which men cannot live together, which is a point of the law of nature, since man is by nature a social animal, as is proved in Politics 1.2. But those things which are derived from the law of nature by way of particular determination belong to the civil law. So the particular, the special, the limited can be viewed as the state, the country. The general can be viewed as the international community, the world. But those things which are derived from the law of nature by way of particular determination belong to the civil law. According to each state decides on what is best for itself. The law of nations is indeed in some way natural to man, insofar as he is a reasonable being, because it is derived from the natural law by way of a conclusion that is not very remote from its premises. In 1935, Epstein expounded upon and expanded these concepts, especially as to the law of nations. Law of nations serves better than any other English term to indicate at once the natural and moral basis of the rules obtaining between peoples and the positive forms given to those rules. It would, however, be inaccurate to translate Jus Gentium and St. Thomas as international law in the modern sense of interstate law. End of quote. The body of rights to which he was referring as all peoples possessing and as coming from God are, quote, the right to conserve themselves in being, to develop according to their nature, to hold property, to bequeath it, to trade, to travel freely, to which we might add the right to speak their maternal language, to follow their own domestic and religious custom, so they be not contrary to natural law, to choose or obey their own local authorities. And he goes on to say, it is in part to protect these rights that first civil society, then international society is formed. The jus gentium is in a sense the end to which international law is the means. For the object of conventions between states is, directly or indirectly, to promote the welfare of the families that compose them, and this welfare comprises the free exercise of all the rights contained in the jus gentium, as well as those arising from the law of nature itself. Such parts of the traditional jus gentium as plainly concern public relations between states, as for instance the immunity of ambassadors, they pertain to international law in the modern sense, they can only be changed by agreement between states. End of quote. Suarez, recognizing the existence of a community of states, held logically that, quote, such communities have need of some system of law, whereby they may be directed and properly ordered with regard to this kind of intercourse and association. And although this law is in large measure provided by natural reason, it is not provided in sufficient measure and in a direct manner with respect to all matters. Therefore, it was possible for certain special rules of law to be introduced through the practice of this same nation. End of quote. Notably, both Suarez and Victoria saw that the essence of the system of international law was equality among nations as among individuals. They both also saw that there was a responsibility for such imperfect communities that lay with more advanced peoples, and they charged the latter with the task of assisting the backward states to a position in which they would be able to look after their own welfare and interests. This concept will come to be known as the mandate or the guardian state. Suarez created a philosophy of law, as I said earlier. In that regard, he determined law to be right and virtuous rule, with the root being the eternal law, followed by the natural law, which is made known by natural reason and through the Decalogue. Natural law consists of all precepts written by God in the hearts of men, and all precepts which may clearly be inferred by reason from natural principles. Natural law included things such as restitution of the property of another or the return of a deposit, as well as observing good faith, telling the truth, and observance of vows and of human promises. The natural law also included the observance of contracts. Treaties of peace and truces are considered parts of the ius gentium as the obligations under them pertaining to the natural law. Additionally, agreements between states are part of the ius gentium, and this use of the power of human agreement has the effect of law. Equality is the principle between men and women and also between countries. The rationale behind international law is that this branch of law, the law of nations, indeed consists in the fact that the human race, howsoever many, the various peoples and kingdoms into which it may be divided, always preserves a certain unity. Not only as a species, but also, as it were, a moral and political unity called for by the natural precept of mutual love and mercy. End of quote. With Suarez, the intercourse of nations means communities have need of some system of law whereby they may be directed and properly ordered with regard to this kind of intercourse and association. And although this law is in large measure provided by natural reason, it is not provided in sufficient measure and in direct manner with respect to all matters. So therefore, special rules of law must be introduced. Finally, the laws of the international community must exist and are introduced by custom or habitual conduct of nations, and are very closely related to the natural law and most easily deduced therefrom in a manner so advantageous and so in harmony with nature itself that while this derivation of the law of nations from the natural law may not be self-evident, that is, not essentially and absolutely required for moral rectitude, it is nevertheless quite in accord with nature and universally acceptable for its own sake. End of quote. Victoria set forth some of the rules or laws of the natural law, as well as what derive from these principles. He noted freedom of travel, freedom of trade, the bond of relationship between all men, and that it is certainly contrary to natural law for one man to dissociate himself from another without good reason. Rights of foreigners, nationality based on being born within the state, the rights of Christian missionaries to preach and declare the gospel in barbarian lands, the presence of mandates so as to govern lands of less developed peoples for their welfare and the best interests, and not merely for Spanish or advanced profits, the rights of conscientious objectors who believe a war is unjust, and there is a law of nations with the natural law and derived with common consent of all for the good of all, that there is an international community in which international law has not only the force of a pact and agreement among men, but also the force of a law, for the world as a whole, being in a way one single state, has the power to create laws that are just and fitting for all persons, and the compulsory acceptance of peaceful settlement and arbitration by the Pope. Those are the many rules he delineated. Scott explained Vittoria saw that respecting or keeping international law was a moral obligation. International law has not only the force of a pact and agreement among men, but also the force of a law. And for the world as a whole, being in a way one single state, has the power to create laws that are just and fitting for all persons, as are the rules of international law. Consequently, it is clear that they who violate these international rules, whether in peace or in war, commit a mortal sin. It is not permissible for one country to refuse to be bound by international law, the latter having been established by the authority of the whole world. The fourth principle, peace is the object. The Christian desire for peace goes back to the Gospels. In a letter from St. Augustine to Bishop Boniface in 418, the doctor said, peace should be the object of your desire. War should be waged only as necessity, waged only that God may by it deliver men from that necessity and preserve them in peace. For peace is not sought in order to the kindling of war, but war is waged in order that peace may be obtained. Our Lord says, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. End of quote. Christianity upholds and sanctifies the true conception of the fraternity of the human race. How best to give positive form to the universal society of peoples and serve its interests, how the rights of God and His church should be secured in the process. That is the main consideration. What peaceful methods should be involved for the resolution of international disputes, how aspirations of each nation and the true interests of backwards people are to be harmonized with the good of the whole. These are examples of the practical problems whose solution must be integrated into the Christian science of international ethics. End of quote. A society has a common good. There is a common good for the natural society of nations. St. Thomas Aquinas wrote, a law, properly speaking, regards first and foremost the order of the common good. The legal philosopher John Austin, in explaining the positive law, or law created by the actions of men, noted that the importance of intelligence in the creation of law when he wrote that the law is a rule laid down for the guidance of an intelligent being by an intelligent being. The great legal scholar Malcolm Shaw writes that international law has always considered its fundamental purpose to be the maintenance of international peace. Shaw explains that international law is more limited as far as the mechanisms for the creation of new rules are concerned. Custom relies upon a measure of state practice supported by opinio juris, and it's usually, although not invariably, an evolving and timely process. Treaties, on the other hand, are a more direct and formal method of international law creation. The fundamental principle of treaty law is undoubtedly the proposition that treaties are binding upon the parties to them and must be performed in good faith. This rule is termed pacta sunt servanda and is arguably the oldest principle of international law. Treaties take many names to include charter, and the United Nations Charter is a treaty. Treaties, including charters, bring a moral responsibility such that they must be honored, and hence pacta sunt servanda. Responsibility attaches to state actors who violate international law, and that in itself helps to maintain order. Professor Mary Ellen O'Connell from Notre Dame writes, reigning political ideologies that ignore international law have helped to deliver a world in which armed conflicts drag on for decades and vast resources are diverted to war. Peace is not only a moral idea, peace is preeminently a legal postulate. Juridically, it is a metaphor for the postulate of the unity of the legal system. As time would show, the Americans would base the world system on international law, thereby providing for a peaceful, prosperous world. John the 23rd wrote that the international community is to be ordered by reason to achieve peace, two very American characteristics. He wrote, relations between states as between individuals must be regulated not by armed force, but in accordance with the principles of right reason. The principles, that is, of truth, justice, and vigorous and sincere cooperation. Secondly, it is an objective which we maintain is more earnestly to be desired. For who is there who does not feel the craving to be rid of the threat of war and to see peace preserved and made daily more secure? And finally, it is an objection which is rich with possibilities for good. Nothing is lost by peace. Everything may be lost by war. Relationships between states must be regulated by the principle of freedom, which means that no country has the right to take any action that would constitute an unjust oppression of other countries or an unwarranted interference in their affairs. On the contrary, all should help to develop in others an increasing awareness of their duties, an adventurous and enterprising spirit, and the resolution to take the initiative for their own advancement in every field of endeavor. However, as all men are united by their common origin and fellowship, their redemption by Christ, and their supernatural destiny, they are called to form one Christian family. And so there is the need for helping these peoples in a way which guarantees to them the preservation of their own freedom, which includes economic and social development, and the wealthier states providing assistance while rejecting domination, respecting civil institutions, and honoring national characteristics so as to attain universal prosperity. The order must be founded on moral principles, as that is the surest bulwark against the violations of freedom, integrity, and security of other nations. Peace, in other words, is based on right order and justice, and wars are fought to reestablish right order, to reestablish justice. Those are the four principles. I know it's long stuff. You can read this on the internet, on the website, The American Proposition. This is the beginning of part 2. America as the executor of these ideals. On July 4th, 1776, the United States of America came into being. The Declaration of Independence, written largely by Thomas Jefferson, with the assistance from Ben Franklin and John Adams, was adopted and promulgated by the Second Continental Congress. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution set forth not only the principles governing domestic organization, but also America's acceptance of the principles of the law of nations and cognizance of a society or community of nations. It demonstrates the connection between the domestic and the foreign, the necessity of right ordering each with the person as the object of the development, the existence of a community of nations, and the natural orientation of man for peace. So, the provenance of ideas. We have to look at the provenance of ideas. Robert R. Riley, in America on Trial, A Defense of the Founding, writes that America derived its ideas about domestic organization from the Christian or the Catholic tradition. He proceeds from the position that, quote, ideas of democratic constitutional government have only one set of roots in human history. Christendom, which is strongly influenced by its antecedents in Jerusalem and in Athens, and only Christendom has ever indigenously produced modern constitutional government. Very interesting statement. He says that from Athens, the existence of universal truth, a rational universe ordered by a divine intellect, the primacy of reason in man's moral life, the existence and immutability of human nature, and the existence and immortality of the human soul. From Jerusalem, monotheism, creation ex nihilo, the fundamental goodness and reliability of creation, man-made in the imago Dei, salvation history. Finally, from Rome is Christianity, the universalization of the truths of Judaism, stated above, the incarnation and the culmination of salvation history in Christ, the de-divination of the world with the final end in pantheism, the separation of the sacred from the secular, and the recognition of the inviolability of the individual person. According to Riley, the main, and perhaps the most important channel of conveyance of these ideas was through the English philosopher Algernon Sidney, who was executed for treason by King Charles II. According to Riley, Sidney's work conveyed influences from the Middle Ages through Hooker, Bellarmine, and Suarez on the subject of equality, popular sovereignty, the requirement of consent, the rule of law, and the right to revolution directly to the American colonies. However, America, end of quote, however, America received ideas about the law of nations, or international society, from Henrik de Vattel, who wrote Law of Nations, or Principles of the Law of Nature applied to the conduct and affairs of nations and sovereigns, and that book was published in 1758. It was one of the most widely read books by the founders, and it contained ideas on the international order that originated with Suarez in the School of Salamanca, and by implication St. Thomas Aquinas, as well as Holy Scripture. The American founders also repeatedly referred to it, and making various arguments before the Revolution, during the Revolution, and after the Revolution, and into the Constitutional Convention, and even after the United States Constitution took effect. Vattel was of the school of Grotius. Grotius, we have seen, was influenced by Suarez and Victoria, who in turn influenced by Aquinas and the Gospels. Grotius and Vattel were of the naturalist period, as Vattel sought to find a prior conception of natural law, standards of just conduct, in addition to prescribing rules to govern the relations of independent agents, individuals, or nations in a mutually beneficial fashion. End of quote. As one scholar wrote, the tradition in which Vattel worked was founded by Grotius, and it was continued by other writers whom Vattel acknowledges. Hobbes, who work in spite of his paradoxes and detestable principles, shows us the hand of the master. Pufendorf, Barbaric, and Wolff. The law of nations, in conjunction with the natural law, had become established as an academic subject in Germany with the creation of a chair for Pufendorf at Heidelberg in 1660. The trend was resisted in France. Vattel belongs to the by then century-old tradition of political philosophy that combined natural law with the concepts of an original state of nature inhabited by individuals and of a social contract as a procedure by which legitimate political authority may be constituted. His presentation of these ideas carries on the whole the fundamentally liberal implications that were becoming increasingly common in the 18th century. Natural law is understood as a body of obligatory moral principles prescribing basic duties and rights for individuals and suitably adapted for states in their relations with one another. Unlike some of his predecessors, Vattel does not present his law of nations in conjunction with an elaborate natural law philosophy, in which questions regarding the epistemological status, justification, and obligatorieness of the natural law are treated in detail. The ethical structure of Vattel's doctrine, for example, the distinction between internal and external obligations, appears to be its most derivative part, and his claims about natural law appear to be assumptions or perhaps a kind of shorthand for moral premises that he simply finds plausible or attractive. Rather, Vattel is more concerned to assert that independent states or nations, which may be thought of as primarily free and independent persons, may also usefully be considered as existing together in a state of nature. Despite the sovereignty of nations and their logical desire to enrich themselves at the expense of others, oppress and dominate, Vattel understood there was natural society of mankind at the international level. War is that state in which we prosecute our right by force, wrote Vattel, but nature has given men no right to employ force unless when it becomes necessary for self-defense and the preservation of their rights. Vattel wrote the universal society of the human race, being an institution of nature itself, that is to say, a necessary consequence of the nature of man. All men, in whatever situation, in whatever stations they are placed, are bound to cultivate it and discharge its duties. They cannot liberate themselves from the obligation by any conventions, by any private association, when therefore they unite in civil society for the purpose of forming a separate nation or nations. They may indeed enter into particular engagements towards those with whom they associate themselves, but they remain still bound to the performance of their duties to the rest of mankind. End of quote. A general maxim or duty was set out by Cicero as being the fulfillment of the law of nature or the fulfillment of justice, which is nothing is more agreeable to nature, more capable of affording true satisfaction than an imitation of Hercules to undertake even the most arduous and painful labors for the benefit and preservation of all nations. Therefore, nations being obliged by nature reciprocally to cultivate human society are bound to observe towards each other all the duties which the safety and advantage of that society require. The offices of humanity are those succors, those duties which men owe to each other as men, that is, as social beings formed to live in society and stand in need of mutual assistance for their preservation and happiness, and to enable them to live in a manner comfortable to their nature. Now, the laws of nature being no less obligatory on nations than on individuals, whatever duties each man owes to other men, the same does each nation, in its way, owe to other nations. Such is the foundation of those common duties, of those offices of humanity to which nations are reciprocally bound towards each other. They consist generally in doing everything in our power for the preservation and happiness of others, as far as such conduct is reconcilable with our duties towards ourselves. So, a nation has as the chief object of all of its duties itself being preservation and perfection, together with that of its state, and the nation, quote, ought on occasion to labor for the preservation of others, and for securing them from ruin and destruction, as far as it can do this without exposing itself too much. This includes helping a nation that is afflicted with famine or other calamities, and so contribute to the perfection of other states when it's to the use of force. So Vattel was telling the founders, you have to help other countries. You do it peacefully. We're in a community. We're in this together. The American founders read this, they understood this, they implemented it. And if you look at American history, it's all throughout American history in our relations with the world. Nations have the right to ask for help when in necessity. The offices of humanity provide the love to help other nations in their time of necessity, and so every nation is obliged to cultivate the friendship of other nations and carefully to avoid whatever might kindle their enmity against her. There is a general prohibition of doing any harm to others, of causing them any prejudice, in a word, of injuring them. Vattel proceeded with the rest of the book set out rules which translated as rights and obligations, with the argument proceeding from the point of view of an individual, as a nation is itself like an individual. And so one of these obligations is mutual commerce, respecting different titles between sovereigns. Each nation has a right to security and a right to preserve itself. Each nation has, as an evident consequence of the liberty and independence of nations, all have a right to be governed as they think proper, and no state has the smallest right to interfere in the government of another, as sovereignty is doubtless the most precious of the rights that belong to a nation and should be respected. The exception to this was if a prince, by violating fundamental laws, gives his subjects a legal right to resist him. If tyranny, becoming insupportable, obliges the nation to rise in their own defense. Every foreign power has a right to succor an oppressed people who implore their assistance. There is no right to interfere in the government of an independent state, and such may be opposed. Similarly, there is no right to interfere in the religion of another nation, especially force of arms may not be used to oblige her to receive a doctrine and a worship which concerns religion. However, when a religion is persecuted in one country, foreign nations who profess it may intercede for their brethren, but if persecution is carried to the extreme of tyranny, then it becomes a case of manifest tyranny in opposition to which all nations are allowed to assist an unhappy people. So nations can jump in and help oppressed people against tyrants. As justice is the base of all society, he went on to write, the sure bond of all commerce, then all nations are therefore under strict obligation to cultivate justice towards each other, and the right to justice is a perfect one. That is to say, is accompanied with the right of using force in order to reassert it. This is Catholic teaching. Justice may be obtained by force and right defense, and an intentional act of injustice is undoubtedly an injury which can then be punished. This is an aspect of the right to security. Okay, there was an American commitment to the law of nations, which we get from a guy by name of Chancellor James Kent, who said in lecture one of his commentaries on American law in 1826, which lecture was entitled "Of the Foundation and History of the Law of Nations." He said that the Second Continental Congress, by ordinance of December 4th, 1781, held that Congress claimed cognizance of all matters arising upon the law of nations and professed obedience to that law, according to the general usages of Europe. However, according to the Articles of Confederation, each of the states were sovereign, thereby leaving open the possibility of separate and inconsistent treatment of the law of nations. The law of nations, therefore, it was good to form a constitution and make a better union. The law of nations was discussed by the American founders during the Constitutional Convention during the hot summer of 1787. The question was whether the new United States of America would accept all the law of nations and its dealings in the area of foreign policy and relations, or whether it would accept only a portion of the same. The wording of Article 1, Section 8, Clause 10 shows that the Americans would be bound by the law of nations through Congress, or more generally, the national government would reserve the right to determine which actions were worthy of sanctions for having been a violation of the law of nations. The founders, Professor Mary Ellen O'Connell of the University of Notre Dame, writes that the founders expected the United States to comply with international law and for Congress to check a president's lawless rush to war. Without a discussion vote in Congress, this restraining mechanism is lost, end quote. Following the convention, America's lawyers and leadership were informed by the likes of the work of Chancellor James Kent, who's been called the American Blackstone. He recognized the impact of Vattel on American thinking, and he also recognized that of Grotius, who informed Vattel through a line of jurists that I previously mentioned. Kent taught the law of nations was part of American jurisprudence. He goes on to say, thus stood the law of nations at the age of Grotius. It had been rescued to a very considerable extent from the cruel usages and practices of the northern barbarians. It had been restored to some degree of science and civility by the influence of Christianity, the study of the Roman law, and the spirit of commerce. It consisted of a series of undigested precedents without order or authority. End quote. After Grotius came Pufendorf, says Kent, who always held the first rank. His work went more at large into the principles of natural law and combined the science of ethics with what may be more strictly called the law of nations. Is rather a treatise on moral philosophy than on international law, and the same thing may be said of the works of Wolfius or Wolf. The legal scholar Pufendorf, writing in 1672, saw the connection between human rights and human dignity, and with it the need for something called sociability or friendship. Pufendorf argued that human beings having perfect natural rights owed to one another, in virtue of certain moral standing that we assign to each other as a constitutive part of being sociable. Whenever we address another person directly, for example, with a claim like "you must allow me to speak," we implicitly treat them as an accountable, responsible being. Otherwise, why address them at all? The same is true when they address us. In other words, according to Pufendorf, being sociable implicitly involves a reciprocal assumption of basic moral status, us of them, them of us, wherever we interact, and even if the address is one that offends the equal standing of the other. Indeed, this is precisely when dignity becomes most urgent. Thus, Pufendorf writes, there seems to him to be somewhat of a dignity in the appellation of man, so that the last and most efficacious argument to curb the arrogance of insulting men is usually, I'm not a dog, but a man as well as yourself. End of quote. In Kent's second lecture, entitled Of the Rights and Duties of Nations in a State of Peace, he said, as the end of law of nations is the happiness and perfection of the general society of mankind, it enjoins upon every nation the punctual observance of benevolence and goodwill, as well as of justice towards its neighbors. This is equally the policy and the duty of nations. They ought to promote a free intercourse for commercial purposes. The numerous wants of civilized life can only be supplied by mutual exchange between nations of the particular productions of each, as every nation has the right and is disposed to exercise it of judging for itself in respect to the policy and extent of its commercial arrangements. The general freedom of trade, however reasonably and strongly it may be inculcated in the modern school of political economy, is but an imperfect right. End of quote. These ideas, these concepts, these values inform generations of Americans who are dedicated to law to right order our society. Now, we picked this up later with the 19th century with James Brown Scott. But what you had by the 1820s was this understanding in America of the importance of the law of nations and of these four principles: the primacy of the person, the existence of a community of nations, of which America was part, hence the Declaration, the importance of law, whether it be natural law, civil law, treaties, the importance of law in regulating that society, and finally, peace as the natural order of man, and seeking the well being of other members of the community. Okay, that's a long talk. Thank you.